In the fall of 1981, I applied to join the federal police with the goal of becoming a traffic officer. I was accepted and, after training school in Mexico City, I received my first assignment in the state of Michoacán. In the first years, everything went exactly as I had always imagined. I had 2 jobs working on my motorcycle and chasing the bad guy sand. Nothing else mattered at all. In 1978, I was promoted to corporal, which meant a bit more responsibility and slightly higher pay, but I was still doing the same thing, working on my motorcycle and chasing the bad guys. Yet, in 1990, I was promoted to sergeant in the federal police. I thought I wanted to move up. It meant higher pay and more benefits, but what I really wanted was the freedom to do things my way. Being locked behind a desk was not my style at all. I suppose it was around that time that I happened to meet a federal agent. I was sitting in a barber shop in Morelia, minding my own business and getting a haircut, when this older gentleman came in who looked like he had just stepped off the set of an action movie. I instantly recognized his duty belt, which identified him as a federal agent. I struck up a conversation with him and asked about his work. He described my personal paradise. By that time, he was already a captain, not a rookie, but in his career he had almost complete operational freedom. "You earn that freedom after you become a federal agent," he said. "They don't just give this kind of freedom to anyone. But once you have it, your superior basically says, 'Here's the job, go out and do it, and everything else is up to you.' I wanted that kind of freedom more than anything else. From what I understood, joining the federal police meant I could have it, at least until I was too old and worn out to do my job. I applied and was accepted. In 1992, I was reassigned to Mexico City when I was assigned to the Federal Investigations Department. I worked on a few cases for a while with a partner, like a probationary period where I could learn from a more experienced agent, but after I passed that stage, I was on my own. As long as I kept things legal, I was free to investigate in whatever manner I deemed appropriate. The only thing that mattered was getting the job done. But as the saying goes, that much freedom also comes with a great deal of responsibility. And this was the worst of them all. Shortly before Christmas 1992, a 15-year-old teenager named Maria Garcia disappeared from her home in Morelia. A few weeks went by, and the federal police could find no trace of her. While she was still on the missing persons list, the local police had little hope of bringing her home. Just as they began to wind down the search, I was assigned to a murder in a motel in Querétaro. The victim was a student at the Autonomous University of Querétaro who was found in the bathtub, with her forearm cut from the wrist to the elbow. Initially, the local police thought she had taken her own life, until they saw strangulation marks around her neck. It was a murder, but staged to look like a suicide. At first, I didn't understand why this was assigned to me when the local police could have perfectly handled it. Then they showed me security camera footage from the hotel on the night of the murder. It showed the suspect going in and out of the room multiple times, but only once did he escort someone who looked like a 15-year-old teenager from his car to the room and back. A 15-year-old who strongly resembled the missing Maria Garcia. The way they explained it to me was that this psychopath had pulled her into some kind of violent crime spree, and it was only a matter of time before he killed her as well. My job was to prevent that. We quickly had a potential suspect. Rumor had it he was a member of a fringe church in the state of Hidalgo. In those days, there were some strange people in Hidalgo, and Jonathan himself had had multiple run-ins with the law. But what really made him my main suspect was the fact that he had previously been arrested for trespassing and harassing another 15-year-old teenager. She herself had filed the complaint, and the report was strange from start to finish. But what interested me most was that our suspect, while simply walking around someone's property without permission, had asked the girl if her name was Maria. He had been searching for Maria for a long time before finding her. But what made Maria Garcia so special? What was the connection between them? I suspected that if I could figure that out, the whole case would unravel in front of me. But just as I began my investigation, our suspect left a second body at a motel in Guanajuato, about 20 kilometers from my post. A housekeeper entered a room to clean and found herself in a nightmare. A 17-year-old high school student had been crucified to the bed frame, and our killer had dismembered her piece by piece. It looked like a death by 1,000 cuts, as if he was trying to open every blood vessel in her body. There were no bloodstains on the floor of that motel room. We suspected the killer had laid some kind of plastic sheeting down to keep the scene clean, but now I'm not so sure. I helped the local police in Guanajuato search the crime scene from top to bottom, and there we found an earring belonging to Maria Garcia. It was tucked into a pillowcase, which meant it was very unlikely to have just fallen out and ended up in that pillowcase while she was sleeping. We suspected she had placed it there to let us know she was still alive and had been in the hotel. But again, I'm not so sure anymore. We suspected they were headed west, so I went to Jalisco to meet with some of my fellow federal police officers there. We hoped to intercept our suspect before he committed a third murder. We combed through all the motels we could, armed with photos of Maria Garcia and our prime suspect. We thought it would only be a matter of time before we got a call from one of the motel owners. But when we finally did get a call, it was to inform us that a third body had been found, only this time it broke the pattern in a very serious way. Instead of a young girl, the victim was an adult man, and instead of being attacked in a hotel, he was murdered in his own home. Yet again, unlike the other murders that had a certain method to their madness, this third one was just a scene of absolute horror. The victim lay on the floor of his kitchen. There were no wounds on his limbs or torso, but his face was barely recognizable. Someone had bitten him deeply, hundreds of bites all over his face. However, not a single piece of skin had actually been torn off, just bite marks, some overlapping and intersecting, but there must have been hundreds of them. The man's face was completely and utterly mutilated. As you can imagine, we were very disturbed by this change in approach. The idea that our suspect was forcing Maria Garcia to witness all these appalling crimes, possibly as some form of psychological torture, telling her, "This could happen to you as well," made me lose some sleep. But when the autopsy report arrived and I read the coroner's findings, everything changed. According to the report, the pattern of the bite wounds on the victim's face was slightly too small to have been made by an adult man. Instead, the medical examiner proposed that the bite marks belonged to a much younger individual, someone who had not yet fully grown. I didn't want to believe it. Nobody wanted to believe it. But the evidence was there before our eyes. Either our suspect was throwing us off by changing his method and using a dental prosthesis, or our kidnapping victim wasn't so innocent after all. By this point, I had thrown all my preconceived notions out the window. The idea that Maria Garcia was a runaway had been ruled out fairly early. She was an average student, a quiet girl, and supposedly a bit easily influenced, according to her parents. Considering the suspect's history of harassing girls named Maria, we assumed it was a straightforward abduction, and the young Maria was simply too afraid to attempt an escape. Who knows, maybe one of the first things she saw was her kidnapper strangling another girl to death. It made sense that she might be paralyzed with fear. But if those were indeed Maria Garcia's bite marks on the face of our third victim, maybe she'd flipped a switch inside. If that were the case and she no longer wanted to be found, we stopped circulating Maria's photo and focused on photos and composite sketches of our suspect and the vehicle we believed he was driving. My main suspect was finally identified and located. He was in a remote part of the Jalisco mountains, in an old abandoned farmhouse. When my colleagues and I arrived, we found him dead, apparently a suicide by hanging. Next to him, we found a suicide note claiming he was innocent and haunted by the ghosts of the girls he allegedly killed. The investigation revealed that although he was clearly disturbed, he wasn't solely responsible for the crimes. He had an accomplice who remained unidentified. The question of Maria Garcia's fate remained unanswered. That night, after a long day of investigating, I returned to my hotel room in Jalisco to get some rest. I received a call from one of my informants, who claimed to have information on Maria Garcia's whereabouts. We met in a remote location to discuss the details, and the information was shocking. Maria Garcia was not dead but was being held hostage by a criminal organization. Her kidnapper was not just her tormentor, but also a member of this organization. My informant gave me clues as to where Maria was being held and promised more intel to help in her rescue. Armed with these new insights, I immediately set out to rescue Maria Garcia. It was a risky undertaking, but I was determined to find her and bring her home safely. The rescue mission was successful, and Maria was returned unharmed. It turned out that she had been caught in the crossfire of rival drug cartels and was being used as leverage against her family. After her release, Maria was reunited with her family, and I received recognition for my role in solving the case. It was a turning point in my career as a federal agent and a reminder of why I chose this profession: to protect the innocent and bring justice, even in the darkest hours. Shortly after midnight on December 13, 1990, the lifeless body of 33-year-old Maria Ypres was discovered in a backyard in a poor neighborhood of Mexico City. She had been robbed, beaten, and then executed with a single shot from a pistol to the head. Hours after the body was discovered, the case was assigned to Detective Juan Manuel Torres, a rough-looking man with a certain accent in his speech and a similar style of dress. Detective Torres knew Maria, who in her mid-30s had been one of the most experienced escorts in the entire colonia. Among the sex workers he regularly found dead on the street, Maria was almost at the bottom of his list, as she was quite familiar with violent clients. But it was no coincidence that she had survived so long in such a dangerous job. Maria was extremely shrewd at her work and rarely practiced her trade with strangers on the street. Instead, she visited a small number of regular clients, some of whom trusted her enough to take her home at night. Evidently, though, that trust was badly misplaced this time. After Maria's body was taken to the medical examiner's office, Detective Torres made sure to observe the autopsy. The huge hole in her skull clearly indicated the cause of death, but those present soon noticed something else about the condition of Maria's body. While Detective Torres and his colleague stood just a few feet away from the blue plastic cart on which Maria's body lay, Dr. Elizabeth Lopez lifted the eyelids of the deceased woman. She did this to note the color of Maria's eyes, but what stared back at her were two empty sockets. Dr. Lopez was morbidly impressed. Maria's eyeballs had been so carefully removed that both her upper and lower eyelids remained fully intact. The doctor informed the detectives that the person responsible would have required extraordinary skill to carefully cut the 6 main muscles that hold each eye in its orbit, which meant there was a harrowing possibility that Maria's killer was a trained surgeon. Detective Torres knew that without a murder weapon, witnesses, or significant forensic evidence, he was in for an uphill battle. There were few leads to answer the many questions surrounding Maria's murder, especially what kind of person would do something so twisted. A few hours later, patrol officers Regina Gomez and Juan Morales began their morning shift. The area covered by the two officers included a once popular business district just outside the city center that had, over the past 25 years, fallen into severe decline. The economic deterioration had been followed by a dramatic rise in crime, including drugs, homelessness, and most of all, prostitution. Gomez and Morales were tasked with establishing a community policing presence in the area. Rather than aggressively pursuing people involved in minor or non-violent offenses, the Mexico City police sent Gomez and Morales to gather information that might lead to the arrest of more dangerous or insidious criminals. But to collect that information, they first had to win the trust of some rather unconventional allies. Many in the Mexico City police referred to this area as public relations work, but Gomez and Morales might more accurately be described as heavily armed social workers. Instead of arresting the many sex workers who frequented Avenida Revolucion, the two officers mainly focused on their safety. Anyone caught soliciting during the day was arrested, but those who worked at night in the so-called quarantine zone of the Motel Venus, the most run-down motel, were essentially left alone. As the women began to appreciate the police protection more and more, they started talking, and soon Gomez and Morales had built close relationships with several of them, as well as a rough idea of the local organized crime networks. The morning of December 13 was like any other. As the two officers approached the Motel Venus, they quickly spotted one of their regular contacts, Veronica Rodriguez, 26. At their first meeting, Veronica had challenged their presence by openly soliciting a client right in front of them, then angrily resisting any attempt to intervene. A few months later, Veronica greeted the officers with a friendly smile, but still remained noticeably guarded. So when Gomez and Morales turned onto Avenida Revolucion that morning and saw Veronica calling out to them with a panic-stricken look on her face, they knew something had gone terribly wrong. The moment they pulled up and lowered their windows, Veronica leaned against the car and shouted, "They almost killed me last night." She went on to explain that her client had gone crazy in the middle of the night and tried to strangle her in a cornfield south of the city. Veronica was known to tell a few wild stories, but this time, the officers had no doubt she was telling the truth. Then she told them she had been rescued by a random passerby who had chased down her attacker, but when asked for this knight in shining armor's name, her memory suddenly became hazy. A few days later, the plot thickened. Gomez and Morales spotted Veronica riding in the cab of a truck with a middle-aged white man named Carl. Certain that she was working for him, they followed the truck north through the city until it finally pulled into the parking lot of a cheap motel north of the Colonia Doctors. As they approached the truck's cab, the two officers came to an abrupt stop when they saw that the man they had followed was actually Detective Juan Manuel Torres. Wearing an expression that spoke volumes, Detective Torres told Gomez and Morales he had been waiting for them. He knew these two officers would do whatever it took to protect the sex workers who might be in danger, and he hoped they would help him catch a monster before it could strike again. Veronica's story about her attack the previous night tied in with a string of sex workers' murders in Mexico City, each with the same horrifying details. Every victim had been killed with a single shot to the head. Each victim had empty eye sockets, and each had suffered a series of brutal sexual assaults. The most disturbing detail, however, was the killer's modus operandi. The surrounding flesh of each victim's face had been surgically removed, with particular attention paid to the eye muscles. It quickly became clear to the police that they were pursuing an extremely methodical and dangerous serial killer. The next few months were marked by a series of murders that displayed the same brutality and precision as the earlier ones. In April 1991, however, there was a brief pause in the murders, followed by the discovery of another skinned corpse of a young girl. This time, the police had a witness who saw a white man leaving the crime scene. The police distributed a composite sketch of the suspect, and soon a few calls came in about a man matching the description, seen coming and going several nights in a row on Avenida Revolucion. A background check revealed that he was a former doctor named Dr. Santiago Mesa, who had been fired from a nearby hospital following multiple complaints of sexual harassment. Though he had never been officially charged with any crime, the police learned that Mesa had suffered an emotional breakdown several months before his dismissal. With that information in hand, detectives cautiously approached Mesa's house in May 1991. When he left his home, the officers arrested him without incident and took him to the local police station for questioning. Although he denied any involvement in the murders, Mesa eventually confessed to having killed 6 women in Mexico City between 1990 and 1991. During his interrogation, Mesa said that after his 1988 divorce, he became drawn to sex workers. He claimed he killed each of his victims in a sort of trance and couldn't recall removing their eyes or cutting away the facial muscles of each victim. Finally, Mesa admitted that he had thrown the eyes of each victim onto a nearby garbage dump, where the police, upon arriving, made the disturbing discovery of several pairs of human eyes that had been discarded. Mesa's trial began in February 1992, and with it came a form of closure for the community of sex workers in Mexico City. Although Mesa was sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes, the damage he had inflicted upon the Mexico City sex work community persisted long after media attention died down. For many, the scars of violence and betrayal had not yet healed, and the lessons learned from this tragic period would linger in the hearts of many people for a long time to come. On May 2, 1949, James Byrd Jr. was born in Jasper County, Texas, the third child of Stella Mae and James Byrd Sr. Stella Mae was a Sunday school teacher, while James Sr. was a deacon at the New Bethel Baptist Church on Martin Luther King Avenue in Dallas, Texas. Both parents tried to instill in their son a strong moral and ethical sense of hard work, and for a while, Jr. stayed on the right path. However, it didn't take long for James Jr. to fall in with bad company, which led him to some very poor decisions. Between the ages of 20 and 37, James was repeatedly arrested for various offenses, including theft, forgery, and parole violations. His final charge led him to serve a considerable amount of time in prison, but after his release, James swore to turn his life around. By 1998, at 49 years old, James worked occasionally as a vacuum cleaner salesman. He was also known to walk everywhere, which likely meant he'd been barred from driving in some way. James could easily have gotten around the driving ban by borrowing a car from a friend or family member, but that might have risked another parole violation, so instead, he preferred to walk. On Sunday, June 7, 1998, James was walking through Jasper County after having spent the evening with some friends and relatives. There was music, a barbecue, and a small inflatable pool for the kids. After a few beers and some time to let them settle, James mustered the energy to walk home. Shortly after 2 a.m., he said goodbye to everyone and headed out into the dark streets of Dallas, never to be seen alive again. Between 2:30 and 3 a.m., James was walking along a long, dark stretch of road when a truck pulled up next to him. The men inside claimed they recognized James from his many walks around Jasper County and offered him a ride wherever he wanted to go. James climbed into the bed of the pickup, and the driver took off. However, instead of bringing James to his intended destination, the driver took him east out of Jasper County to a small clearing in the woods. Once there, the men allegedly ordered James to get out of the truck, and sensing that something was terribly wrong, he did so. But when he tried to run, the driver of the pickup, along with 2 other men, chased James into the clearing and attacked him. Forensic evidence suggests James put up significant resistance, but in a fight that was 3-on-1 against younger, physically stronger men, he stood no chance. After they overpowered him and James lay on the ground, his attackers continued the assault, beating him all over his body before dousing him with paint and urinating on him once he was unconscious. Then the men dragged James's unconscious body back to their truck, wrapped a chain around his ankles, and attached it to the rear bumper. James was dragged 3 miles along the road, and an autopsy later suggested that he remained alive for at least half of that distance until his bones shattered and his body was ripped apart. What remained of him was left in front of a historically African-American cemetery in Dallas. The next morning, the police found bits of James's body at 81 different places along the road, along with a crucial clue: a cigarette lighter engraved with the nickname Possum. Given the extreme nature of the case, there was a strong incentive to solve it as quickly as possible. The Jasper County Sheriff's Department was soon contacted by the FBI, which offered its help. Within hours, the FBI had made a breakthrough in the case. Possum was the nickname of a 23-year-old man named John William King, who was already on an FBI watch list for his ties to a known group of white supremacists. King also had several white supremacist tattoos and was found to be a full member of a neo-Nazi prison organization called the Confederate Knights of America. King was arrested, and after a short investigation, it was established that the other 2 men in the truck that night were Sean Berry and Lawrence Brewer. At the murder trial, it was concluded that Sean Berry, 23, did not share John King's racist views, but was found equally guilty in the death of James Byrd Jr. Lawrence Brewer, 31, however, was a committed white supremacist who had previously been convicted of drug possession and robbery. According to his court testimony, he joined a white supremacist gang in prison alongside John King to protect himself from other inmates. The prosecution painted him, however, as a man who had joined not reluctantly, but enthusiastically. One of their key witnesses was a psychiatrist who claimed Brewer showed no remorse for his crimes, calling him at one point a racist psychopath. The prosecution bolstered its experts' statements with a letter intercepted by prison guards, determined to be written by King, in which he acknowledged that the murder of James Byrd could carry the death penalty, but that he did it anyway, regardless of the outcome. King also wrote, "We made history," before signing off with "death before dishonor." Prison officials also noted that both King and Berry had attempted to acquire a copy of a book titled The Turner Diaries while awaiting trial. Published in 1978, The Turner Diaries was written by the racist William Luther Pierce, a founding member of the now-defunct National Socialist White People's Party. The novel depicts a violent revolution in the United States that leads to an uprising, a nuclear holocaust, and ultimately a race war in which ethnic minorities in the U.S. are systematically exterminated. Brewer's final meal request included 2 chicken fried steaks with gravy and onions, a triple meat burger with bacon and cheese, a cheese omelet with ground beef, tomatoes, onions, green peppers, and jalapenos, a bowl of fried okra with tomato sauce, a pound of barbecued meat with half a loaf of white bread, 3 fully loaded fajitas, a meat lover's pizza, a pint of Bluebell vanilla ice cream, a peanut butter fudge bar topped with crushed peanuts, and 3 large root beers. When the food was presented to him, Brewer looked at the huge amount of food, locked eyes with a corrections officer, and said, "I'm not hungry." Due to certain food regulations, prison staff were not allowed to redistribute the large amount of food, and they were reportedly forced to throw it all away. The news sparked outrage across Texas, and State Senator John Whitmire demanded that the 78-year-old tradition of offering final meals to death row inmates be ended. The director of the prison authority agreed, announcing that the practice would cease immediately on April 22, 2019. John King's appeals were rejected by the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals and the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, and he was executed on April 24, 2019, at the Texas State Penitentiary. Though it may be easy to celebrate King's death, it is harder to comprehend why James Byrd had to die in the first place. Instead of succumbing to anger and despair, James's family found the strength to turn something ugly into something beautiful. In the years following his death, family members helped establish the James Byrd Foundation for Racial Healing. The eccentric former basketball player Dennis Rodman donated $1,025,000 to the foundation, while boxing promoter Don King set up a $100,000 scholarship fund for Byrd's 3 children. Perhaps the best way to sum up their outlook is to recall their statement in the midst of tragedy. How does one respond to such a brutal act? Seeing a loved one tortured and lynched caused an unimaginable feeling of loss and pain. Yet revenge, hate speech, or the promotion of hateful propaganda never crossed our minds. We thought, what would Jesus have done? How would he have responded? The answer was clear. His message would have been one of peace and hope. I opened my eyes and saw a night sky full of stars. It was very cold, but I had no idea where I was. I looked to the right, then to the left, and felt the cold snow behind my head crunch as I moved. I tried to push myself up on my elbows, but everything hurt. Then I saw many trees around me, so I realized I must be in a forest. I could see my breath as steam in the air. It was freezing, and my fingers started to ache. I rested on my hands, still wondering why I was here. Then I looked down to see what I was wearing, and I couldn't make sense of it. I had on a strange outfit, a short pleated skirt in black and yellow, short white socks and white shoes. I was also wearing a top in the same colors with the words "Tops Cheerleaders" on it. But who were the Tops cheerleaders? I felt as if I were losing my mind or trapped in a nightmare. Why was I wearing this outfit in the middle of a forest at night? My hands hurt, and not just from the cold. When I looked at them, I noticed cuts and dried blood on my right hand. Then a voice in my ear told me to relax, to close my eyes, and to remember what had happened. But how could I remember anything before this? At first, there was only darkness. My head started to ache, so I tried opening my eyes, hoping it would help, yet it didn't seem to work. Suddenly, I found myself in a moving vehicle. The next time I opened my eyes, I was in the back seat of that vehicle. When I looked around, I saw it was some kind of van, and all the girls inside were dressed just like me, in cheerleader uniforms, talking to each other. The seat next to me appeared empty, so I looked ahead, out the front window of the bus. I saw the headlights illuminating a tree-lined road covered in snow. Then I noticed some lights from houses off to the side. The driver slowed down and pulled over. I watched about 4 girls step off the bus and head toward a house. Then the door closed and we drove on. This happened a few times. Eventually, I turned around in the bus and saw a girl sitting alone in the back, but I didn't know her and couldn't identify her. It was as though I was watching and trying to remember what happened so I could understand how I ended up here. Suddenly, I opened my eyes again. I was still in the snowy forest, feeling the cold. I heard a sound and listened carefully, but there was nothing. Then a voice in my head told me to close my eyes again. Back in the van, it turned around a bend between the trees when I suddenly saw a car on the side of the road with the hood up. A man was standing on the road, waving to get our attention. The bus slowed and came to a stop. The driver said, "Stay in the bus. Girls, I'll see if I can help." He was wearing a green jacket with the hood up because it was snowing. I remembered watching him leave the bus after putting his hood up and closing the door behind him. While I sat in my seat, I recalled the girl in the back, who had moved to sit right behind me. It seemed like she was talking to me, but I couldn't remember her words. She addressed me by my name. I paused and opened my eyes again. I was still in the woods, but this time I was standing under a big tree, trying to shelter myself from the snowfall. From what the girl had told me, when I thought about it, she said my name was Ashley. But I didn't recall my name being Ashley. What was going on? Suddenly, a voice in my head said, "Stop. Close your eyes and focus." I closed my eyes. My head still ached. At first, everything was black again. Then an image began to form. I was back in the bus with the girl behind me. We were both looking out the window as our driver approached the man in the middle of the road. They walked together to the car that had broken down. I opened my eyes. I looked around and was still next to the tree. I thought I heard something in the woods, so I listened carefully, but it was really dark. I tried peering between the trees, and all I could see were snowflakes falling between the branches, making a soft noise as they landed on them and on the ground. I closed my eyes again. This time, I saw our driver returning to the van. The snow was now falling heavily, and his hood was still up when he came back. I remembered how he got back in, closed the door, and returned to his seat to start the bus and continue driving. We drove past the broken-down car, and I noticed the hood was still open, but the man was leaning over the engine. Then I recalled the girl behind me talking to the driver, but he didn't answer, which I found odd. I noticed he still had his hood on while driving, and I wondered why he was wearing it inside. Then I remembered the girl behind me was named Sarah. My memories started to return. We saw a few house lights on the left side. Sarah said something like, "Where do I get off? I'll see you tomorrow." She stood up to leave and told the driver, but he didn't look at her and didn't respond. Sarah started screaming, but instead of stopping, the driver sped up and drove right past her house. Then we took a sharp turn onto a bumpy path that looked like a logging road. Sarah was terrified and started crying, yelling at the driver. He turned toward us, pulled down his hood, and yelled. We were both shocked. It wasn't the driver we knew. He looked older and had a scar on his face running from his eye to his nose, plus dark hair. Then he turned back around and kept driving only now, much faster. I opened my eyes and looked around. It was still snowing, so I realized the man who had been leaning over the car with the open hood must have been our real driver. That meant this other man had taken the driver's jacket and pretended to be him. But why, and what was his motive? I closed my eyes again and tried to remember, but my body hurt, though the memories were slowly returning. Then I closed my eyes. I was back in the bus. We were being tossed around as he drove recklessly off the road. Sarah was screaming by now, and I recalled telling her to stop and to scream as loudly as she could. He turned to us again, this time with a knife, threatening us. Suddenly, I opened my eyes and stopped remembering. I looked at my legs and saw that they were cut and scratched for some reason. I was so exhausted I couldn't stand up. I sat in the cold snow against the tree trunk. The guy must have used the knife on my legs, but why did he do that? Where was Sarah? And most importantly, where was our real driver? I closed my eyes again. The bus slowed down as its headlights shone on a path. It was heavily overgrown and looked eerie. Branches on both sides scraped against the bus, tapping the windshield. The bus veered sharply to the right into some bushes and arrived in a small open space. We both clung to the front seats, looking ahead. The headlights illuminated a small, low wooden building. Then the driver got up and told us to get up. He went over to Sarah and grabbed her arm, scaring her, telling her to stop screaming. He hit her hard, which took her by surprise. He dragged her to the door and then glared at me, warning me not to run or I wouldn't get far. I remembered how he took Sarah away from the bus. Then my inner voice said, "You have to run, this is your only chance to get away." I went to the back of the bus and saw the emergency exit door, which could be opened from inside. I quickly fumbled with the latch, hoping he wouldn't return at any moment. I slammed the window with a hammer, breaking it to pieces, then crawled through the doorway. My knee got scraped on the edge. I remembered I had to run to the trees to escape, so I ran as fast as I could among them, not knowing where I was going. Then, all of a sudden, I tripped and crashed hard. After that blow, everything went dark. I opened my eyes and looked around, wondering if this was now or before. I looked up to the left and for the first time saw a steep embankment. That must have been where I fell. Then I heard footsteps running, but darkness enveloped me once more in an instant. I opened my eyes in a flash. I was lying on a sofa in a modern, dimly lit room. A woman sat in front of me, and a sheriff next to her. They explained that a hunter had found me wandering in the woods early that morning. The police had already been informed about a man who was stabbed and found lying beside his car on the road, bent over the engine with the hood up. That same night, 2 girls had been reported missing. They never found the man, but they found Sarah. She was in that wooden building, injured and tortured. She survived, but her life was changed forever. I felt as though I were trapped in a dream within a dream, or a nightmare within a nightmare, utterly helpless and out of control. Why had I been on that bus with those girls in the first place? The whole experience left me terrified of alcohol. Even its smell makes me fear for my life. If I hadn't been drunk and hadn't gone to that party with the other girls, I wouldn't have been so foolish, so drunk and unaware of my surroundings, and maybe I could have prevented what happened to Sarah, or even stopped our driver's murder. Above all, I might have been sober enough to remember everything that happened, to recall all the details of that awful night.